Today, we have the opportunity to examine the history of youth work organizations in America. With us, we have Dr. Joyce Walker, professor at the University of Minnesota. She's also a valued faculty member at the Youth Work Institute. I'd like to learn more. How is it that you decided or endeavored to find out more about the history of youth work organizations?
Well, maybe it was an accident, but it was when I was teaching, it's been nearly 20 years now, teaching in a graduate program in youth development leadership here at the university. And it just was absolutely clear that when we started talking about organizations and were places where people worked, it's the students, that what the organization believed, its values, its traditions were really important to the work that was getting done today. Sometimes supporting it, sometimes at odds with it. So students and I started looking at some of that history. We discovered the Anderson Library on the Minneapolis campus, which has wonderful archives. I mean, just incredible archives on the YMCA, but of camps, of the United Way, of the boxes of things that tell the story of the history of this field that we are in, this youth development field, this youth work field. And it seems to me that it got increasingly important to know the history and what lay behind the organizations we know today. I also had a chance to go to a couple international history conferences and began to see that the same sorts of trends we would see in the United States, we were seeing in Europe, particularly we were seeing in England. So, it just grew in relevance, and the more you learn, the more interesting it becomes, I guess.
So, yes, it's interesting to you, the history of youth work organizations, but why might it matter to other people, especially those that are entering the field?
Well, as I alluded to, it's really important to know something about the organization you work with, because work is mission-driven. Finances, all of the decisions are really driven in an organization by its mission. So one ought to know about the organization that you're in. I think as we move to build a field here out of youth work and this area of out-of-school time learning and non-formal learning, we have to recognize that our histories come together. We are not a bunch of isolated organizations that just happen to sort of pop up for sort of no reason, but we were a response to the social and political and historical events that were going on. And it's a field building kind of effort from my perspective. And I guess third, it's really just to appreciate the commitments of these grandmothers and grandfathers who came before. I mean, many of them just incredibly important contributors in education, social welfare, political movements, even Amelia Earhart, who was, a flyer and a youth worker. So we know more, and we can be wiser about understanding that we're not the first people doing this work for the first time.
So let's dig in a little further. What was youth work in response to? The youth work organizations that evolved, what were they responding to? How did they develop?
I think of them as sort of being three categories. One of them is, and this is maybe more recent history, they developed to support the formal schooling. They are enrichment, they are complementary, they supplement things that are going on in the school system. So we do see a whole lot of youth organizations that kind of align around school. A second group really have come up and come to being in an effort to fix or control young people. We might think criminal justice, but they're a lot more than that. Yeah. Groups that have formed and come into being to keep young people off the streets, to keep them busy, to address the fact that people can be threatened by young people, especially if they're in large numbers. So both prevention programs and programs that are very targeted often are social control kind of mechanisms. And probably the largest group, I think a very interesting group, are what I call primary supports, which are programs that develop to address these kind of interlocking spheres of life. They're interested in character and social development, citizenship and literacy, outdoor leisure, recreation, family life. In some ways, it's about learning how to be a young man or a young woman in the society that you're living in. And so we see those categories, you know, coming together. But in truth, I think we have to say that most youth organizations, almost all, didn't start responding to the basic needs of young people or the interests of young people. They came about in response to needs that people, adults, young people as well, saw in society needed to respond to. I have a quote here by a study of some people at the University of Chicago at Chapin Hall. And they said organizations have to live with their past. Organizations that serve young people are seldom structured to promote youth development. In fact, some of these organizations have mandates, goals, or organizational structures that exist in direct conflict with adolescent needs. Compromises made to accommodate historical and current contexts and missions profoundly affect the way adolescents are treated and viewed. So this is the struggle. Why do we come about? How do we start? And then how do these organizations adapt over time to meet the needs of young people? I mean, if you think back to colonial times, kids were just people. I mean, you know, they
You're not
weren't
a youth.
picked out. They weren't youth. That's right. They were in families. When they were 8, they were given a pony to train. You know, they worked in the fields. They worked with their families. Families were the unit of social control. They were the guiding force. They were the educators of young people. Schools were for the elite. They were for males. They were largely religiously driven. And so you find that there was no need to point them out for anything special. And it was when that started to change that I think we begin to see this movement begin. And one of the, you know, some of the historians, Judith Erickson, who has written a lot about youth organizations in the country, said that it was really, I think 1831, when a faith-based initiative in Philadelphia started the Juvenile Missionary Society, became the first national indigenous youth organization. And it was really motivated by people who said, if we want to get people involved in faith organizations, churches, synagogues, we've got to get their kids. The kids will bring the parents. And so they had this huge outreach and started an organization. You belonged, you came together. And of course, you know why young people came. They could be with their friends.
Right.
They could do social things. They, you know, had some special attention, and so it really caught on. The temperance movement was another force that took advantage of the fact that young people, when they get involved, they bring energy, they bring excitement, enthusiasm, that it's kind of contagious, and they're also very influential with particularly their parents.
So young people found their own space to really be young, and so that was really the origin of that sense of a young person.
Yes, yes. So what these organizations were to young people isn't necessarily what you'd see as the mission or the values or the belief of the organization itself. Yeah, that's very true. That runs through it all. Young people will make this experience what they want it to be. But sometimes then that's where it begins to butt up.
There's a bit of tension.
But things began to change rather dramatically pre-Civil War, 1800s, in that we get into a lot of industrialization in the country. Young people are leaving small towns, they're leaving farms, they're going to big cities, they're unprepared for the crowded conditions, the way living goes on in a big city. We have waves of immigration, so young people are faced with people speaking different languages, thinking and doing things differently than they do. And their parents and the community worries about who are they with, are they safe, are they going to stay these good character kids we sent from the farm, or are they going to succumb to the big city? And so this was real fertile ground for something like the YMCA, which had started in London, but came into Boston in the 1840s. And with it, the American version began to offer lodging. I mean, early YMCAs had rooms for young men. YWCAs had rooms for young women, where you could come, you could be safe, you knew you had a place you could step off and enter life in the city. And while the organization said, we're about kind of straight living, we're about faith, we're about physical fitness and spiritual well-being and intellectual well-being, kind of a nice square. You were supposed to develop on all these dimensions. In reality, they were playing a safety net role for young people who were coming into the city. The Society for Christian Endeavor is another one that is a little bit different than that mission society we talked about. They decided to bring people together and cross faith lines. All young people could come. And it was an I want to say interdisciplinary, that's not right, interfaith effort.
Right.
Oh, it really caught on. They would have conventions in cities like Philadelphia and Boston. Thousands of young people would come. But this broke down. The Christian Endeavor became called the courting endeavor, because of course you bring a bunch of young people, 16, 18, 20 years old together. The Methodists start to like a Presbyterian, and an Episcopalian begins to, that's right, go out with a Lutheran. And actually one response to that was the churches all began to have their own youth organizations, Luther League, Wesley group at the Methodists, the movement was, oh, no, we don't want them.
They wanted to restrict the cross-pollination.
And so the organization, like the community, sets something in motion. Young people flow to it, but it rethinks it when things don't go just exactly as they thought. We enter a time then, after the Civil War, when there, some of the trends that we'd see kind of begin popping up all over. Mm-hmm. Settlement houses. Settlement houses were, Jane Addams and Hull House is the best known one. But settlement houses were there to help immigrant groups learn the skills they needed to move into mainstream society. Mm-hmm. Public libraries, art galleries, museums were there, began to be built by wealthy men, maybe like Carnegie and Carnegie Libraries, but they were for the education of the populace. And the notion that we needed educated people if we were going to have a working democracy was really important. And the land-grant universities were funded around the time of the Civil War. And that was an effort saying a university like the University of Minnesota would get a federal land to build a university, but they had to forever have the commitment that they would take their learning out to the community, particularly the agricultural community. They wouldn't force people, deny people education because they lived in Monoman County, right, or they lived in Pipestone County. They didn't have to come to the university. The university would go to them. And a wave of kind of progressive education really, gained momentum at that time. And again, these ideas of more and more organizations beginning to respond to this, to the activity. It's not an accident that militaristic or uniformed youth work happened at the time when we were waging wars in Mexico, wars in Central America. The British were fighting the Boer War in South Africa. I mean, Baden-Powell started the Boy Scouting in the United Kingdom after he came back from a battle of Mafeking in South Africa, and he and his little group of soldiers were able to withstand an assault, I mean, just a full-scale assault, and he came back and felt they had been so well trained. I mean, they were scouts. They could go out and make their way through the terrain, and they could collect information, and they could plan. And he came home and he looked at sort of the boys in Britain going to school, and he thought they were a bunch of wimps. And so he said, we can't put up with this. We have to begin to get our young men into muscular Christianity, and that was one of the sort of the terms. And so, and this wasn't just for the elite class at the public school, private public school in England, but this was for young people overall, young men. And so Girl Guides, which then developed also in the United Kingdom, the forerunners to Boy Scouting or Girl Scouting here, were uniformed because that was one of the ways that you perceived you kept your troops and your units and your, using these military terms, these divisions in order. In the United States, after the Civil War, and as we move into the 20th century, you see an awful lot of groups who really wanted to assimilate upon migration, found they wanted to maintain their connections. So the Sons of Norway and the Daughters of Norway, and and you had groups for the Polish and the Germans and all of the Eastern European groups who came. Many of those, they formed lodges. The adults would go and be members, and the young people, they would have organizations for the young people. This is again, Judith Erickson is really the kind of premier person for documenting these hundreds of groups that were there to keep the ethnic, cultural, language of origin of the family alive. The religious groups and the patriotic groups did the same. The Masons, the Elks, the Moose, the Knights of Columbus. They spawn a group of organizations, with wonderful names. The Rainbow Girls, Job's Daughters, the Knights of Sir Galahad, the Queens of Avalon. But they were there to keep the faith, the patriotic, moral principles